We're ready to proceed with our fourth speaker. She's Hannah Mack-Boll. Her title is, "What is Your Intention?"
Two months ago, I participated in STAR training with the Center for Justice and Peacebuilding, Strategies for Trauma Awareness and Resiliency. Towards the end of the week, a trainer asked for a volunteer to drive home a point she was trying to make. Eager to get out of my seat and move a bit after having spent way too much of the week sitting, I volunteered. She had me leave the room, gave instructions to the class, and invited me back into the space. Once up at the front of the room, she asked me to stand and face my fellow students with both arms raised perpendicular to my body. I was instructed to stand firmly. She would push down on my right arm, and when doing so, I was to resist her push. She did this several times. The first time, I stood strong. She was barely able to move my arm much at all. The second time, she pushed my arm down to my side almost instantly. It wasn't fatigue from standing firm the first time, because the third time, and several subsequent times, I was able to resist her touch. There were times that I could, and times that I could not. The same year I was born, 1994, Italian scientist Giacomo Rizzolatti produced one of modern neuroscience's most sensational discoveries, by accident. Rizzolatti, undertaking an entirely different study, happened to notice that as he picked up food pellets and placed them in a box, his study monkey, just sitting there, perched, watching him, was firing brain signals as if the monkey himself was the one moving the pellets. This happenstance is what led us to the modern discovery of mirror neurons, that I, at a neurological level, am mirroring you. Now, 23 years later, I stood in front of a classroom of over a dozen other students, and something within me was mirroring them. After our little experiment, the trainer let me in on the secret. Every time that she would push my arm, she would, behind my back, give either a thumbs up or a thumbs down to the rest of the room. This was their indication to think either positive thoughts or negative thoughts about me. The times that they sent quiet, positive thoughts my way, and maybe expressed them a bit in their body language too, were the times that I stood strong, resistant, and resilient to the trainer's touch. But the times that they sent bad vibes my way, I crumbled. I'm sharing this story with you now for more than the hopes that it will encourage you to think positive thoughts about me right now. I'm sharing because this was the first time I had heard of what I've come to wonder about as the phenomenology of trust, relationship, and reconciliation, the study of intentions. We mirror not only another person's movement, but her emotional state and intentions as well. But what does it mean to be a mirror? And what do our intentions have to do with trust, relationship, and reconciliation? Let me share two stories with you to illustrate this connection. A few months ago, I returned to the US from Colombia, having spent just under a year learning and working alongside victims of the over 60-year armed conflict, and alongside the social workers and professionals that accompany them every day. The organization I was with works primarily with families forcibly displaced from the war, families with stories of the incredible violence that accompanies war. Every day, I saw the weight in the shoulders of the victims who had fled their homes and found themselves in our office. And I heard the comments of the social workers saying that this person lied and that person probably did too. I don't blame the social workers for wanting to make sure that the people who needed it most received the attention that they were able to offer. There were times I imagine they were right too. They had listened to clients tell their stories for years. But regardless, I wondered what it would look like if the social workers had been aware of their mirrors. When one of the social workers would relate to someone whose story they believed, whose story they trusted, they would stand in a grounded manner, they would speak compassionately, affectionately, and the client would often leave lighter, mirroring and embodying what they had seen in their caregiver. But when they would talk with someone whose story they did not believe, they would stand tense, they would talk firmly, and this too was mirrored. In reality, we could never know who walked those doors, having truly been displaced and victimized by the war. But what would have been different if the social workers had mirrored their radical compassion to everyone who walked through those doors? We are, after all, mirrors. At some point, I realized, or perhaps just remembered, that the problems of intentions and trust were not unique to where I found myself in Columbia. In fact, they were manifesting in my very own community in Harrisonburg, Virginia. On November 28, 2016, Eastern Mennonite University published its report of the investigation in response to allegations of sexual misconduct by the former Vice President of Enrollment and EMU's subsequent compliance with Title IX, the Clery Act, and other rules, regulations, policies, and procedures. The report, reflecting D. Stafford and Associates' independent investigation, found that Eastern Mennonite University held no responsibility in the case, it did not find any systemic failings, and it supposedly wrapped up a painful part of EMU's most recent history. I do not want to point, and I certainly do not want to place blame where it is not warranted, but I do want to ask, much like in Columbia, what parts of this process trusted the victims' narratives, and what parts did not? What were EMU's intentions, and how was this felt? In Columbia, the doubt and distrust were likely not tendencies of the individual social workers, but rather the effects of a violent 60-year war that had taught them to do just that. In one of John Paul Lederach's books, The Immoral Imagination, he references an old journal entry of his from his time working in Columbia, and he mentions the combination of pessimisms that float about the country. I found that the structural pessimisms there were what made caregivers doubt the very people they were trying to help. I have to wonder whether the investigation at EMU also showed the consequences of what we might call structural pessimisms. This report was not about people-to-people mirror, reflections, or explicit intentions, and maybe that is the point. Was the process undertaken with the DSA one that truly, fully trusted the painful narratives brought to the table? It respected process, it aimed to restore trust in the system, but what about the people? Did the process recognize our responsibility as individuals to be mirrors of radical compassion to those most hurt by the violence, despite what the systems were saying? What about our responsibility as Christians? Our responsibility as a Christian university? Our responsibility as a church not unfamiliar with the pain of sexual violence? I recognize a Jesus that came to contradict the powers that be, to bring hope to those affected by an oppressive system on top, and to remind us that power can come from the bottom. Divinity was the ability to stand with the masses, the marginalized, despite what the systems were saying. Franciscan priest Richard Rohr says that all divine power is shared power. There is no seeking of power over in the Trinity, but only power with. A giving away, a sharing, a letting go, and thus an infinity of trust and mutuality. So what do we do when we encounter systems that don't trust us? That is where we emerge with our intentions, to seek this infinity of trust. What happens when you place two mirrors face to face? Has anyone here ever stood between and seen the infinite expanse? That between is where we emerge with our intention to stand in the way. Black civil rights attorney and law professor Derek Bell invites us to do just this. He reminds us that service requires humility and the recognition that sometimes our actions are of more help to a system than to the victims of that system whom we are trying to help. He says, only with that realization can we seek change, quote, that is less likely to worsen conditions for those we are trying to help and more likely to remind the powers that be that out there, are persons like us who are determined, who are not only not on their side, but determined to stand in their way, end quote. He calls for humility, a power with. Let us remind the powers that be that out there are persons like us who fully intend to stand in their way in one of the most seemingly simple ways possible, by offering each other what the system often cannot, an infinity of trust and good intention. And it is only your good intention that will keep my arms up. Thank you.